Hyderabad. With this book launch and conversation, The Living Air, we move on this month to the World Music Day on the 21st of June at Eram Manzil, a public place, the mall, from 4 to 9 p.m. with close to 60 musicians playing at this mall, open and free for all. Please do join us. Next is a photo exhibition by Kishore Krishnamurthy that will be here in this hall on the 24th of this month. It is indeed a privilege to host a tall figure of birdwatchers community in Hyderabad. With his most recent book, The Living Air, The Pleasures of Birds and Bird Watching. And to launch his book in Hyderabad before it does anywhere else, Aasheesh, I'm so glad that Anita, thank you that it is Hyderabad, at the Hamburg Hall at Goethe-Zentrum, Hyderabad. And as a part of the Hyderabad Literary Festival online event. The event today is presented by the Hyderabad Literary Festival, Juggernaut, and Goethe-Zentrum, Hyderabad. Aasheesh asks in his book many questions. And do please pick up a copy. There's one right there. It's a fabulous read to cherish, to enjoy the flow, the poetry. And he asks, do we have time to stand and stare? I'm extremely happy, Aasheesh, that you took the time and now sharing the joy and passion to engage with birds and bird watching with us. We all know the genteel, soft-spoken birder of Hyderabad who has spearheaded the birders movement by giving it wings, and know, of course, of his several publications. Aasheesh Pittie is the editor of our ornithological journal, Indian Birds. His publications include Birds in Books, which is 300 years of South Asian ornithology. This came out in 2010. And the written Birds in Books, Part 2, 2022. He maintains a searchable bibliographic database of over 35,000 works of South Asian ornithology. We are requested to come and join us here, please, Aasheesh. A round of applause. We have with us Anita Mani from Delhi. She lives, works, and she says birds in Delhi, from where she runs Indian Pitta, her book imprint with Juggernaut Books. In addition to editing books about birds and natural history, Anita writes on technology and communications, a throwback to the times she ran the operations of communications software company. Her work journey is similar to that of a migrating bird, she says. She has oscillated from writing for mainstream media to a corporate career in investment, banking, and later in the tech world before she ran a news and current affairs publication for children called Child Friendly News. For now, she's content to watch, read, and write about birds. We will talk more about The Living Air shortly, and I request Anita to please come and join us here in the front. You know, it is hugely exciting that not only do we launch The Living Air here today, but we are also launching, and this is the first and very exciting publication by the Indian Pitta Books for the, thank you, Sita. I have to be online and visible as well for the viewers. So if you see somebody waving from the back, we are just following instructions for HLF online viewers, which I must also, of course, welcome heartily. But I come back to the Living Air, which is part of the very first book that's published by the Indian Bitter Books, the first dedicated book in print for bird lovers, conservationists, and policymakers. I invite Anita Mani to talk about her book imprint with Juggernaut, The Living Air, and other books in the making, or even the one freshly out of the oven just now. Over to you, Anita, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Amita. It's really a pleasure to be here in Hyderabad, my first visit to the city, and welcome. And what a great way to start a relationship with the city, I think. And it's it's so apt in many ways that this is the book that we're launching the imprint with. As Amita mentioned, we are an imprint of Juggernaut Books, and our mandate is to focus on books about birds and, by extension, natural history. There are a lot of bird books about Indian birds available today. A lot of them are field guides, and very important. I think we all grew up learning to bird along with these beloved field guides. But we thought that there was something more that needed to be written about birds, about their ecology, about the environmental challenges surrounding avifauna in India, about landscapes, about personal explorations of bird watching, like Aasheesh's book is, and other ways to celebrate what we all love doing, which is birding. And that's the idea with which this imprint was launched last year. And like I said, there could be no better book, in my opinion, to launch than with The Living Air. Though, as Aasheesh and I know, it happened purely by accident, and a very happy accident, I would say. And the reason why I say it's so apt is because The Living Air celebrates a way of bird watching that chases observations and not number of species seen. It's a way of looking at birds. It's a way of engaging with the landscape around you beyond just dotting off lists and lifers and all those other happy things which we bird watchers love to do. And I think there is a certain meditative quality in the book, a mindfulness which sort of suffuses through the pages, and I think it's sort of transmitted through the computer cables out of my machine, because it was by far the most meditative edit I've ever done of anything. And I think that's like, really, that's lovely. We didn't feel like work. We didn't feel, and that's such a blessing. So without saying anything more, I'd like to hand over to the author of The Living Air.
Well, I think we can just, shall we? We'll have the book release. I'll just give the format to those who just joined. We will have the book release now, and then we will invite Aasheesh and Sita Reddy for a conversation. We will be open to question and answers here from the audience present here. Thank you so much for all of you for coming from afar. And the online viewers are also able to raise questions. Please do so in the chat box available, and we will filter them through, and as many questions as possible. Anita and Anita will see that most questions are raised as per the time available. So thank you all for joining, and I hand it over to Aasheesh to now start the launch procedures. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to invite some of my old birding friends with whom I started bird watching to come and release the book with me. First, I would like to call my good friend Mukund Kulkarni. He and I started bird watching almost together. I didn't know the language, he knew the language. I had the car, so he went around. He was very good with directions and remembered roads, so that helped a lot. I would also like to call Mr. Shafatullah, who's been a great friend and birding companion for many years. And I'd like to call Dr. Professor Murthy, who's now the president of the Deccan Birders, but a long time birding companion. Please come.
Thank you for that, Aasheesh. We now invite the author, Aasheesh Pittie of The Living Air, The Pleasures of Birds and Bird Watching, to be in conversation with Sita Reddy. Sita, may I invite you to please come to the front? Thank you. Sita Reddy is a writer, historian and curator whose recent works on nature has focused on cultural histories of flora, plants, trees, forests, gardens, landscapes, and ecosystems. Trained as an anthropologist, her interdisciplinary work draws on art history, environmental humanities, and literary studies. She's currently working on a book on Indian nature, writing from colonial to contemporary times. Thank you, Sita, for taking us through the conversation and the book, and thank you, Aasheesh, again for being here.
Thank you for that intro, Amita. Yes, guilty as charged. I'm a writer and historian, and it's a great place to start this conversation and also explain what I'm doing here. Because, to be honest, when Aasheesh invited me to be the conversational partner, my first response was the dreaded imposter syndrome. Like, but I'm not a birder. But the beauty of this book is that because Aasheesh writes so beautifully about birding in his own backyard, I realized what I could provide was giving it some context from the point of view of nature writing and environmental humanities. And as in Anita's introduction, what was like apparent is this book is receiving a lot of reviews from environmental historians like Mahesh Rangarajan last week, right? So I want to actually position this book as a book not just on birds and birding, but it's terrific nature writing. And I see this book in the long line of the finest nature writing at its best in the Indian context, in the tradition of E.H. Aitken, who you mention a lot in the book, and M. Krishnan, and among ornithologists, Salim Ali, who was a brilliant writer, in addition to being a great scientist. But also in the West, an illustrious line ranging from Thoreau to Aldo Leopold to Rachel Carson, and then moving on to those who write about birds, particularly J. Baker and Helen MacDonald and Mark Cocker, who wrote the gorgeous foreword for this book. And in fact, Mark Cocker lists all the ways in which The Living Air embodies what has been called the new nature writing that came out of Britain. And I'm going to list them all so that you can just like follow along as we speak, as by way of context. The first is that the author is brought front and center, and there's a relationship of the writer to the birds that he sees. The second is that there is the exemplary in the ordinary. Like he finds the exemplary in the ordinary, and this book is all about that. Then there's a sense of place and eco-loss, a real sense of what Hyderabad and its birding environments bring to I think the quality of birding that Aasheesh has done over 3 decades. And finally, the kind of near spiritual, otherworldly connection, what Cocker also refers to as a re-enchantment with birds. This is in the New Nature writing. So all of which makes it the ideal launch for the Indian Pitta imprint. And as Anita just described, these are natural history books that, and I quote, go beyond field identification manuals to explore the bigger mosaics of habitats, ecosystems that touch the lives of birds, end quote. The lives of birds. Keep that last line in mind as you read the book or listen to this conversation, because that is key to the book and to Aasheesh Pittie's sensibility as a birder. Birds first. So for those who haven't bought the book yet, and I hope you will, because it's really worth it, let me briefly summarize using Aashish's words, the structure of it from his own intro. So, let's see. The essays in this volume have been written over 30 odd years, and some were originally published in diverse print and digital media. Some of the information they contain was pertinent at the time of their publication, though I have updated facts and figures where necessary. They reflect my joyous evolution as a birder, observer, thinker, and writer, a celebration of the non-human living world. They are arranged under 4 broad sections. The first contains my encounters with birds. The second is about birding experiences. The third has brief appreciations of 3 birding stalwarts who influenced me. And the fourth comprises ruminations on my kind of birding. A strict chronology by publication date has been deliberately avoided to allow a natural melding of articles. It's written for varying audiences in daily newspapers, specialist birding journals, natural history magazines, online blog posts, or in my personal journals. End quote. So, there's a whole range of these articles, and I think part of the joy has been like encountering them out of order, so to speak. Here we want to do a quick shout out to Sangeeta Kadur, who is a very big part of the book, the wonderful artist illustrator from Bangalore, and her line drawings, one of which is sitting right here as an honored guest, and which we will talk more about both Sangeeta's illustrations and I guess the quality of what that kind of line drawing does to the text, to enhance the text when we read from our therapy later. But for now, let me just mention 2 things here about the visual mood that these illustrations kind of create. One is that it evokes another time. It's a time of old-fashioned naturalism, when pre-photography, in which art and science were combined in this quest for even documentation. And the second is there's a tactility to it, there's a texture to it, a handmade quality that reminds us that this artist, this human being was there in the field, drawing using the same observation skills that the author used in notes and writing. So, there's all of that. I hope we can get back to that. Thank you, Sangeeta, for changing the look of the book, and the choice of drawings over photography is something that I hope there will be a lot of questions in the Q&A and that we must talk about. So let me go back to what I said about re-enchantment, about that idea of the connection with birds. And let me begin with the book's title and subtitle. Like William Blake's Grain of Sand, it really contains universes, worlds, and they were chosen very carefully, I know, by you. So the living air, for those who don't know yet, comes from Wordsworth's poem, Chiltern Abbey, written on the banks of the River Wye in Wales, which is a very far cry from our Lucy. So tell us why you picked Wordsworth, Aasheesh, and maybe a little bit about what these romantic poets captured for you in terms of that oneness, wealth that you speak about.
Thank you, Sita. Before I begin, I'd like to give a shout out and thanks to the Goethe-Zentrum, to Amita and her wonderful staff for allowing us to have this function here, and to HLF for hosting it too. We are very grateful for that. The living air, as you said, is part of a phrase from Wordsworth's poem. I came across it in something I was reading, and this stanza was quoted in that work. I can't remember where it was, but I wrote it down immediately. I have this habit of writing down phrases or words which in some way I feel will help me in the future to either write an essay or for a title of something I want to write. And when I was thinking of a compilation of these essays, this title, this phrase as a title was always in my mind, and so I have used it. You know, on a very simple level, it draws human attention to another realm. We are always stuck to the earthly, the terrestrial. You know, most of what we think and speak of and look at is around us on hard land. But there is this realm of air which we hardly ever think about substantially. And the fact that birds populate it and use that medium or that realm more than they perhaps do land, etc. At least to move around, they use the air. And the word living air is really loaded with a lot of meaning, and it somehow suited this collection, so I used it. And Wordsworth, as a poet, is also very deep. All of us have studied him in school. People must be remembering daffodils. But over years, I have realized that there is a very great depth in his poetry, and I think all romantics of that age, all the poets of that age, had this common thread sort of thing running through their work, which brought about a sense of oneness uh, amongst living things. And they melded all those thoughts together beautifully in their works, whether prose or poetry. Perhaps the audience here will get a better sense of where the phrase fits in into the stanza. Would you mind reading it out for them?
Sure. And so this is a short stanza from a very long poem.
Quite a long.
Yeah. I mean, we did Tinton Abbey in the 12th. Oh,
Really?
I see. Yeah. Didn't know it was in Wales then. But, okay, so this is the stanza. For I have learned to look on nature not as in the hour of thoughtless youth, but hearing oftentimes the still sad music of humanity, nor harsh, nor grating, though of ample power to chasten and subdue. And I have felt a presence that disturbs me with the joy of elevated thoughts, a sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused, whose dwelling is the light of setting suns, and the round ocean, and the living air, and the blue sky, and in the mind of man, a motion and a spirit that impels all thinking things, all objects of all thought, and rolls through all things. End quote. Really beautiful. And sort of you see both that line, the round ocean and the living air, as well as that quality of what we've talked about later, his inward eye, right?
Yes, yes, yes.
I think that's the phrase, no? Inward eye.
True, that is true.
So that ties in actually, Aasheesh, the book has 3 epigraphs. One is by Wordsworth, one is by Whitman, and then there's a passage from the Ashtavakra, which ties it all together in terms of that Advaitic oneness, right? I mean, sort of like many titles in nature writing today talk about that interconnectedness of all beings. Entanglement is a word that is favored these days. Perhaps that's a good segue to the subtitle. I was thinking about this. Pleasure, the joy and wonder of seeing that oneness of nature is so different from seeing nature as separate from us. And I was thinking of what authors like Amitav Ghosh have said about that separation, that is because of that separation that we have historically seen nature as a resource for us, for our purposes, with all the hubris that human beings can bring to that exercise. And in Nutmeg's Curse, Ghosh moves beyond the moment of the Anthropocene to talk about colonialism, and he calls this the resource curse. Do you think it's not such a stretch, but could pleasure be seen as the antidote for that curse, for this curse of resource, seeing nature as a resource.
Yes, absolutely. Because, if you don't take pleasure in something, you can't understand it. And without understanding, you can't like it. And so, when you lack understanding, there comes a separatedness between you and what you are seeing. And that is where you see the other as perhaps a resource. And that's where, you treat it as a resource, as a utilitarian object that you can make use of for your personal benefit or the benefit of the community. But so it is pleasure in something, and it could become a pleasure that the entire community enjoys, which will translate into not seeing something as a resource, because as an individual one can not see something as a resource, but that doesn't translate to actually protecting it or taking care of it in the long run. A lot more people have to get involved. So yes, it is an antidote, and bird watching is about pleasure more than about treating it as a resource or taking something out of it. And so this is where things connect with Wordsworth or Whitman or other romantics, and how they bring together their thoughts and the varied aspects of the world, whether it is the ocean that he talks about, or the sky, or the earth, or a flower, or a frog, or whatever. And they don't see a difference. If one really looks deep into it, they don't see a difference between non-human life and human life. And that is once that is the way, that is a person's outlook, then it's pleasurable whatever you are doing.
And then there's this, as you say, this as it ties into conservation. After like John Muir, who writes about interconnectedness, right? So father of the
Yes.
what I think he's in America he's called the father of the national parks, but he ushers in the conservationist ethic in some ways,
That's true,
Yeah.
because the poems that we have spoken about, and the
Yeah.
poets and the movements, I think they are pre what we call today ecology. Ecology as a term didn't exist at that time, but ecology is a science that encompasses all these things and tries to project the findings or the studies as a science.
Right.
And tying up everything together, Muir actually had a lovely phrase for it. He said that if you tug at one string, you realize that the entire world is attached to it, or something like that. And that is what these poets are talking about. That is what ecology is about. And that is, to look at it that way is the way to looking at it with pleasure.
Yes, yes. And the mode of engagement then becomes not more than affection. It's sort of that wonder mixed with they're inextricably part of the same thing.
Yes, you treat them
Same
as you
stuff.
would want to treat yourself.
Absolutely. Let me turn to reading inspirations. You've said that to write well, you have to read well. And you're such a voracious reader. We have all of Aasheesh's friends and Facebook followers and fans have been dazzled by your end of year reading lists, all of our goals. And you have a beautiful description in your intro on how you first encountered Book of Indian Birds through finding the posters in Ames and store, and how you got your first newsletter from the NHS, the newsletter for bird watchers. You mentioned Eha in the essay on vultures, and you mentioned Helen MacDonald in H's for Hawk. I believe M. Krishnan too. Can you say more on what you were reading at this point, like earliest inspirations, but also through the day?
Yeah, sure. So I really became interested in nature and aspects of nature, perhaps in the 9th and 10th classes, when for literature we had a book called Jungle Picture.
Mm.
It was by a lady called Nora Burke, and that she wrote so well. I mean, it was, of course, fiction to a great extent, but very realistic fiction of what forest life is, what animals and birds animate a forest, that concept of a forest wilderness. And that has been a dear favorite ever since, and I must have read it a couple of more times. But that sort of, set me on this journey. And I must say, there were hardly any books available at that time on nature or wildlife or birds or plants. And whatever one got, one just grabbed and read if one was interested. So, Salim Ali's Book of Indian Birds, and his writing is just sublime. I mean, as a scientist, he ushered in an era where statistics were not so important as watching the bird, watching its behavior, really sitting down and writing about the birds. And he wrote really well.
Beautiful. Those passages on, some of his passages on flight,
Yes.
right? Oh my God.
He was absolutely wonderful. And so that was a book that, of course, I read through and through. But I have a list. Do you want me to
Yes, of
actually
course.
read it out?
Yes, so Aasheesh being Aasheesh has done a list annotated by year. I don't know if it's by like
Or just by-
influence.
yeah.
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 But go ahead.
So from around I have a list of few books from 1977, and in that year I bought and read. There was a poetry compilation called Golden Treasury by Palgrave, very popular at that time, still is really as an anthology of poets. And it was in that book that I read one of Walt Whitman's poems, which really struck me. I think it was "O Captain, My Captain,"
Yes.
about Lincoln.
Yeah.
And then, of course, Jungle Picture and the ever popular Joy Adamson's Born Free. These were, Born Free was like, one wanted to live that life at that time, and she wrote it so well. Then in 78, after the Palgrave's Golden Treasury, I chanced upon Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass itself. So I grabbed that and I read that. Then Salim Ali and his niece, like they wrote a book even in that time called Common Birds. That book is written for simpletons like me, where you want to learn about the bird more than about science. You just want to know about the fellow creatures. And
That was in
78. I read it in 78. Then in 1980, the life-changing book by Rachel Carson, Silent Spring.
Also beautifully
Life-changing in many ways, continent changing, policy changing. It was a fabulous. She was a very good writer, and it is not just about the DDT Holocaust that she spoke about. She wrote beautifully, lyrically, feelingly about the sea. And so that was a book that I read. And I can call him our own Jim Corbett's Man-Eaters of Rudraprayag, though that didn't cut much with me.
I mean, that's different sort
Totally
of writing.
different. Yeah, it's a different sort. I enjoyed reading off the cuff Hemingway also. His, about hunting in the Kilimanjaro,
okay,
and he had several on hunting, fishing. He was a big time, big sea fisherman. But I couldn't go back to them. I tried reading them once again in the 90s and the 80s. Somehow that thrill of chasing and killing big game didn't. Then in 82, I read Stones of Silence by George Shala. Now, George Shala was an American scientist of very high caliber, and he's still alive. And his Stones of Silence was about his travels in the Himalayas. Great writer. So I enjoyed that. Then David Attenborough's Life on Earth came at that time. So this Life on Earth, it dealt with all life. Whereas earlier we were dealing with one type of bird, one mammal, etc. Here was a book that sort of spoke of ecology, spoke of the oneness that we were talking about in poems, and that giant Peter Matthewson's Snow Leopard.
Oh, yes.
So in the Snow Leopard was the first time I read about how nature can influence a person's thinking, how it can be a solace to a person's suffering or audience to a person's joys, and how you can relate to nature and write about it. So that was the first different type of nature book that I read. Then Conrad Lawrence's King Solomon's Ring. Conrad Lawrence is famous for his studies on animals getting impressed by humans, etc. It's a different theory we can talk about. But King Solomon's Ring is also written for the lay reader.
Imprinting theory.
Imprinting, yeah. It's for the lay reader where he explains science so that anybody can understand it. That was very well done. Then, who I consider, snowboarding started with, Gilbert White. So he was a man of the cloth and lived in a village called Selborne in England, and he wrote Natural History of Selborne. It is perhaps among the top 5 most selling books in the world, even today. And a very different book which answered questions. Why big fierce animals are scarce, by a man called Paul Colin Bow. Then as it should happen on our first birding trip to Bharatpur, there was a sale of books going on by Raj Publishers of Dehradun. And there I picked up Henry David Thoreau's compilation of works of Thoreau. That changed a lot in my thinking. And again there I picked up another book by George Schaller called The Deer and the Tiger, where he speaks about the ecology of Indian forests with relation to large mammals. Great study. In 1984, I was introduced to an anthropologist, Robert Ardrey, and he was a behavior scientist and an anthropologist. He wrote a trilogy of books on the relationships that humans have had with animals. Just mind blowing. I mean, those theories it was like a blank. I was like a blank canvas, and these guys were really painting vivid colors on it. And then there was The Fate of the Elephant, written about just one mammal, but what it suffers at our hands throughout the world. So there was a world view about the elephant by Douglas Chadwick. He was not a scientist, Douglas Chadwick. He was just a person interested in the animal. Then Leslie Brown's Encounters with Nature. Again, simple essays about this wonderful birds of prey man who wrote about his encounters with nature, various things. From South America, there is an ornithologist whose name is Alexander Skutch, and he wrote something called Nature Through Tropical Windows, which is again not moving out in his own garden, watching perhaps a honeysucker or something and writing chapters on them. Beautiful writing. In 1990, I came across an anthology published by Antaeus on nature. Antaeus had this series of publications on various topics, and nature was one of them which I picked up. It had a compilation of
literary writing.
Literary, absolutely literary. It was like a precursor to the Paris Review, if I may. And they had compilations on authors' journals and notebooks, on literary appreciation, on history, how to study, how to appreciate history. Very nice books. And then, of course, our favorite Lauren Isley's The Immense Journey. So, Antaeus had anthologies at the end of its essayists or authors' favorite books. And many of these books, were repeated by several authors. So I always was on the lookout for them. And Lauren Isley was one big name. And of course, J.A. Baker's Peregrine, which comes later. I found that book only in 2002. But I'll end with that. And before that, there was also the works of John Muir, whom we spoke about in 1993. And he writes about walking in the mountains, and he writes so well. Those books are a must read even today. In Boyhood, in Alaska, his walking in the, and he was the father of who influenced President Roosevelt.
Yes.
To start the park systems and etc.
And Audubon was a huge part of his documentation. What a list! And also Peregrine, of course, was so transformative for so many people, right?
Yes.
That or even just before more, what did you mention? Oh, Lauren Isley.
Nicely,
Lauren
yes.
Isley, if none of you have come across him, this is someone who was an anthropologist,
Yes,
right?
he was.
And it's just astonishing how he could just turn a sort of like the explosion of flowers or whatever it is that he was writing about into poetry, no?
He is a person who cannot be spoken about. His
Ah.
writing has to be experienced
Yeah.
and read to
Yeah.
really understand and imbibe
Absolutely,
it. It was just something.
Where did you find all these books, Aasheesh? So you
So
had
most
to.
of them were bought in a lovely bookshop, which is unfortunately closed down now. A. Hussain and
Yes.
Company on Abbots. That was a regular haunt of mine, and me and my siblings used to go every month to buy one book. That we were allowed just one book, and so yes, it grew. The collection grew from there. As I said, one didn't have a big basket to choose from.
Yeah.
There was, just a couple of books that were available,
Yeah.
and whatever, if nature was even there on one page, I used to buy it because
Yeah.
one never knew where it would be.
No, A. Hussain, all you Hyderabadis in the audience will probably, like recall that as a
Oh, yes.
favorite. It's part of how we grew up, right? So actually, little shout out to Luna Bookstore also, as the independent bookstores that we need for this kind of collection.
Absolutely right.
Sitting
Absolutely.
out there selling
Yes.
your books. So,
Yes, and thank you for
Thank you,
bringing
Luna.
all the books here and for having that wonderful bookshop. But I must tell you that a descendant of Mr. Hussain
Yeah.
is in the audience.
Yes. Oh,
And-
yes.
Yes, and
Can be embarrassing.
no, I think let's carry on. So I think he was the one who had the misfortune of having had to close it down because of things changed. The whole community there changed, and they wanted to use the building for some other purpose. But yes, A. Hussain was the garden of flowers to which all of our honeybees went to come
Absolutely.
in.
Absolutely. So buy books, people from independent bookstores. But so Aasheesh, that was an archivist's dream, that list. On to the next question about bird song. We've talked about this a lot. You have this lovely phrase in the book, birding by ear. And we've been having this conversation on how, with the emphasis on looking and watching, how sound and song is often forgotten in birding. And yet, you mentioned Rachel Carson, whose title of her book is Silent Spring. And bird song is crucial not just for bird watching, but to track environmental change. Because the silence she's talking about is in that summer of 62, right? So what do you mean by birding by ear? Or seeing by, there's another phrase that you do have somewhere, seeing by song.
Yes, so I feel that bird watching is just not complete if you do it only visually. One should use, I believe in using all one's senses, though I don't recommend using taste here. But there are many situations where you cannot see a bird, but you can hear it. I mean, if you go to the Western Ghats, there are these big stands of trees and there are valleys, etc. And the air is resounding with bird song, but you don't see any feathered creatures anywhere. And I've been taught by people who've birded a lot in the Western Ghats, and they always birded by ear, and they could recognize the birds' calls very easily. And I said, yes, this is something even I must get into. And so I purposely, pursued calls which I couldn't identify till I reached the guy yelling his lungs out. And that's how one tends to not forget later on. Because if you don't birdwatch for some time, sometimes you forget the bird song. But if you've actually pursued it and seen it, so it helps a lot. There are times, I'll give you one story. So there are two things. One is when you know bird song, and you can be with something that you like, birds in my case, even when you're surrounded by traffic. There's not a bird in sight, and you're in the middle of a traffic jam. But a shikra or a hornbill flies overhead. You can't see it, but if it calls, yeah, it is there. So it's a thrill that you feel. There must be 10,000 people around you. Perhaps you're the only one who's sensitive or who realizes that there is life beyond the chaos around. The other is, birding around, birding in Anantagiri, and it's a valley and there are trees. And so I was walking down one side of a hill and I could hear a bird call, which I identified, but I couldn't see the bird. And we were looking around for the bird, which I said it is this. And I was carrying a telescope. So somebody who, through their binoculars, spotted a bird on the opposite hill and on top of it, right on top of a tree. So you could see it visually, but it was so small that without the help of optics, you couldn't really clearly see it. So I set up my telescope on it, and there jumped out a yellow throated sparrow. It was calling. So first I heard the call, and it is remarkable that when you are looking at it through the scope, you can see the beak moving, and a few nanoseconds later you can hear the same. You can, as if it is speaking to you, you can hear it in your ear. It's just like the flash of lightning and the clap of thunder that you hear. That same difference happens there. So it brings a different dimension of bird watching to a person, of your experience of bird watching. If you are able to, enjoy, recognize, and appreciate bird song.
You have this essay later on called Birding for Beginners, I think, where you go along with the person and they're just amazed at, they've spotted by sight, I suppose, 2 or 3,
True.
and they're amazed at your list of whatever, like 30 species by song. No? And
Yes, birding areas have their in common inhabitants, and if you go and after reaching the place, just stand still or sit for 10-15 minutes, you might very well record just by calls about 30% of the birds you will see in that entire area.
Yeah.
So you need not see them. So I used to have this list, and they used to think that I was pulling a fast one, but that was the way they thought. But I knew my birds. So there are lots of birders in India who are really good at bird calls.
Well, that leads me to another phrase that you used when, like focusing on bird song, being drenched in bird song. And sort of that leads me to a question about music. Because it's the same thing, right? You had said to me once that listening to music was crucial to learn to listen to birds, to nature, to silence, and to seasonality. And I was always struck by that when you said, we were talking about that a while ago. It was Mirag on June 9th. It is, the rains are almost here. It's monsoon season. So this rain metaphor is so interesting to me, right? Being drenched in the bird song, allowing it to wash over you. Tell us about music. Tell us what you were telling me about the pied-crested cuckoo being the harbinger of the monsoon, but also like how the importance of listening to music for you has been over the course of your birdwatching career.
So it stems from the fact that how do we communicate? Ultimately, whatever we see, whatever we perceive, we like to communicate. And if you have to communicate about something which doesn't understand you, nor I would say we understand them. I'm talking about birds. How do you do it? I mean, we have words. We have nothing beyond words to describe what we see. But in our attempt to reach beyond words, I believe and I think that music developed. And so music is a language where words end. But the human spirit still wants to express itself. And music is what you hear in your surroundings, in the bird calls, etc. And this thought process, of course, arose because I started listening to music. It started off with something which is very loud, Wagner. There were just some LPs in the house, and I one day played it, and I was just blown by the volume of sound and the musicality of it, and the immensity of what to me immediately was apparent was the immensity of the landscape that Wagner had in mind. Of course, when I went out into realms, into areas which had that immensity, very few areas I could relate to as, yes, here Wagner is playing, but there are places which resonated. Joke Falls, that thundering water and, Gotterdammerung happening or Tannhauser, and then even in a forest which has nothing, stillness, but the cicadas are deafening. That is Wagner for me. So there was this very loud music and big, imposing, almost fearsome landscape all around. And then I started listening to Hindustani classical, and that was a sort of a different version of the same tune or music because the notes are the same everywhere. And there is a subtlety in it which is like bird song. There is a simplicity in it which is also like bird song, and there is this pause between notes where there is nothing but silence, and in that silence I feel, for music, that silence is the oneness that the romantic poet spoke about. That silence between bird calls is the reason for the existence of the song. And this appreciation, of course, took time to develop within me, but that's where bird song and human music sort of melded for me, and I was able to pick up bird song and enjoy it so much.
No, actually, it just occurred to me then because some Hindustani musicians talk about the pakad of a raga, right? How it's snatched from the air.
Yes.
And so, in a way, that comes before identification, or that through that you identify the raga.
Yeah.
No, I mean, so yeah, that's great. What's your favorite Meg
So Meg is,
raga
of
or
course,
any Malhar raga?
at this season, of course, in this season, Meg is a must listen to, and if people haven't heard Nikhil Banerjee's rendition of Meg on the sitar, you must. The atmosphere he creates of the stillness before the rains break, and when the tabla comes in later on, it's a clap of thunder, and then he just takes off with the rain. One can just imagine the whole thing, even if there is no rain happening, but just that piece is playing. So that's a favorite of mine. But you had asked about the pipe-crested cuckoo, and
Yes.
so the pipe-crested cuckoo, of course, cuckoos are favorites of Hindustani classical singers and popular singers also. And among cuckoos is the papiha and the koel, which are and the chatak. So the chatak is also the pipe-crested cuckoo in Hindi. And from immemorial times, they are part of our culture. And the pipe-crested cuckoo actually migrates to India from Africa ahead of the monsoon winds. And invariably, we say that 15 days after a bird is seen for the first time, it will rain. It happened this year. One of our birdwatcher friends said that he had seen it, and 15 days later there was rain. I mean, not the torrential monsoons that we expected a few years ago, but it rained. So that biological phenomenon is happening. And after summer, when the monsoon set in, then the musicians had their own bandishes and rags, and so Begum Akhtar has a lovely one on the koel where she's actually chastising the thing. Why are you calling on the papiha? Why are you calling throughout the night? I'm going crazy because it reminds me of my lover. He's not here, but you're going, and what's your problem? Just shut. So there is that. There is also the thing where they use the papiha as a medium to convey their longings and their feelings to their.
It's the cry of the beloved.
So these are things that you enjoy and relate to ultimately.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's move to the section on birds. The 4 sections that I described in Aasheesh's book, and Aasheesh has readings chosen from each of them. So this is going to be a treat. But let me lead you into it by saying, so I thought there was such a lovely, quiet irony that a book with the title of Living Air, The Living Air, begins with essays on the dead, the dying, the endangered, just begins. And because loss and extinction of species is a real way into thinking about conservation. It continues to be. And to mobilize around, as action groups. Some of your finest essays, my favorites actually, are on the. I love the endangered great Indian bustard essay. I thought the declining population of vultures essay was just superb. And at the same time, you talk about the rising, increasing populations of pigeons, how kites are filling niches that are left by the vultures. So, at the end of all of the section on birds, or by species, you have an essay entitled A Deeper Quest, on why it's not enough to just simply identify and name the species, but you need to feel kinship with the bird. So first, could you read from us from Deeper Quest? And second, as a writer, how do you move your field notes or your checklist into what we writers call the story and the situation of that kinship with the bird? And does writing about rare and exotic species differ from writing about, let's say, the common sparrow, or something more ubiquitous?
So, yes, the book does start with a couple of chapters about rare and endangered birds. But you must remember, some of them were written very long ago, and the bustard was in a much better place then than it is today. Today it is almost looking at extinction. Then there was a chance of us saving it. But more than it's also, these essays are also more than being a plane, they are also a shout out that there's hope that we can actually save it. It's pointing out that these birds need our help and we need to. It's that what Whitman calls the yawp.
Yeah.
So the essay is a yawp to the readers. It's called the barbaric yawp.
Barbaric.
Over the roofs of the
Yes.
world. So one has to actually shout out about these creatures who cannot defend themselves or speak for themselves. And people must be remembering that great scene in Dead Poets Society where Robin Williams stands on a desk and talks about,
Yes.
York, top of the world. But anyway, so these 2 or 3 essays, the vultures were not at all endangered when I wrote about them.
Yeah.
I remember at an international conference when Singapore said that we should list vultures as endangered, an Indian got up and said, please take them away, we are willing to export them from here. There were so many vultures at that time, but that's how it is. And so those essays, were written at times when at least 2 species were not. One was abundant, one was not as endangered as it is today.
Yeah.
The Churton's courser was iffy even
Yes.
then. Maybe people say that it's at the end of its evolutionary cycle, but we don't know. It might still exist, for all you know.
And what a rush that was.
Yeah,
To see it.
absolutely. To see a bird, and it was miraculous.
Yeah.
It was like finding the proverbial needle in a haystack, And at night, and it was just magical. Can't even talk
that
about
comes
it.
through because there you have seeing it as proof of its existence.
Yes,
almost.
true.
Yeah.
The best part was that there were witnesses all around and not just me to claim, that I had seen it. And writing about the difference between writing between about endangered and not endangered common birds is that the time you get with either of them. With endangered birds, you may not get time enough to understand them. So one looks at other literature, older literature, and then forms a story. Common birds, you can do a back and forth. You should do a back and forth because one outing, one sighting, you cannot understand the bird. And what will you write about it? So you have to do the back and forth when you go into the field, watch it, come back, add some notes, and ultimately maybe after a year or two of watching, then you say, okay, I think I can write something, and then you put something down. So that is the main difference between the two. And endangered birds don't occur in your backyard generally. So traveling to see them is also a
Part of the,
yes,
you know,
it is a
the-
part of the
the
phenomenon.
whole thing,
The
yes,
whole
the
thing,
journey. Could you read from a different, deeper quest?
Yes, I will.
I'm going to, those of you who have the book can also follow along because the prose is so beautiful. And it's nice to follow along with you.
So, A Deeper Quest is not such an old essay. It was written recently, but it sort of speaks about the change in my own journey, birding journey. I also used to go out and write checklists of birds and come home and just transfer those checklists into fairer checklists about. But then these questions came up when I read about birds. So this time also when I birded and came back, I had written notes while I was there, but something struck me and I just wrote down this essay after returning. So I'll read out a couple of paragraphs from an essay called A Deeper Quest. And I'm asking these questions. It was a community birding that happened. Birdwatchers went out there. So I start reading now. I did not even look around me from the punt to record the landscape I was in. An forgivable lapse. What lay on the other side of the bund? Fields, no doubt, but of what and in what state? Standing crops or harvested ones? If the level of the water in Anna Sagar was any guide, then they'd have been well irrigated, either ready for harvesting or recently cut. The water seemed to have been spread over a fourth of the full tank level. But this was remembered in hindsight. A conscious on site assessment, however anecdotal, was missing. Because of some field experience and a sketchy knowledge gleaned from reading, one surmised a patchy biology of the birds comprising the landscape. But isn't a deeper need to understand or at least observe one's surroundings owed to the birds if one wished a closer kinship? Identifying creatures and naming them brought me no closer to them than identifying and naming sports stars. At least I knew a part of the latter's ecology, but I cannot fool myself about my ignorance of the former. What sustained the two species of shrikes that hunted amidst the thorny screen of acacias? Why did a brain fever bird falcon in and drop upon a low branch of a babool out of nowhere? Were the magnificent short-toed eagles sporting airily overhead, softly whistling their amour? And those fluttering, scampering warblers, what were they chasing down amidst the cracked bark and needle-sharp thorns? So engrossed, so busy, but were they satiated? And what did they prey upon? Go deeper in your queries next time, birder.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
This is actually at the end of the section on birds. This is the last essay. Oh, sorry. So, well, like then we also have the kind of nature as therapy, right?
Yes.
As healing, the healing power of birds, birding. I came across this term in the New York Times ornithology birding section, a new segment on birding, and starting with the famous now Central Park birder.
Yes, yes.
So the word was ornithotherapy, and I thought immediately of your owl therapy essay, and it's particularly fortuitous because now we have Sangeeta's illustration here to the essay
Yes,
of owl
yes.
therapy.
Mortal
So-
wood owl.
Yeah, absolutely. So I wonder if you could read a bit from owl therapy, and in kind of homage to Sangeeta's illustration and back to the text as well.
So, ornithotherapy is part of a healing process. You know, when nature is the best healer, they say, and when you go out and if you have a problem, invariably nature helps you. Perhaps just a walk in nature under trees. There's a lovely Japanese term called Shinrin Yoku, forest bathing,
Yes.
where people, it's self-explanatory. But a walk in under trees or sitting on a beach or something is really calming, and it takes you out of the problems that you are facing many times. And this essay, Owl Therapy, was written when I was in one of those dumps. I think I had a migraine that day and things were not going well. So, and then I heard this racket outside and it was really bothering me. So, I wanted to find out what was creating that racket. So, I began reading. I went down and then I start reading now. Within the fragile safety of a million still leaves, the humidity was 75%, perched a bottled Buddha. 5 species of birds were screaming werehawk for all the world to hear, forcing this shadow of the night to seek sanctuary. The house crows were trying to pull its tail feathers in hesitant, jittery sallies. The white-headed babblers, fluttering their open wings, hopped on branches all around, uttering their panicky, shrill alarm calls. A black drongo buzzed the owl smudge frequently, careful to keep a margin of safety for evasive action. The common miners grated and shrieked their hatred with forceful venom. And the tree pies, they actually dove from behind and hit that feathered edifice repeatedly on the head. I stood in a feathery mizzle with mosquitoes pinging around my ankles in the middle of a vegetable garden, mesmerized. Mine were not the only problems in the world. Here was a relic whose body held the essence of patience, tolerance, and wisdom distilled over aeons far greater than the span of my temporal troubles. Two dark, serendipitous orbs gazed down at me, riveting in their serenity, with the stillness of deep forest pools. Was this a lesson in flesh and blood? Alone, the owl bore a humiliating tirade from fellow aves, hunkered into itself, consumed by the flame of survival burning within it, assured by an instinctive wisdom that this too would pass. As light merged within darkness all around, I realized how true this was. By and by, the oppressors went away, leaving the wise one to its ways.
Wonderful.
So here, the illustration that everybody sees
Yeah. And then-
illustrates this, yes,
Yeah, I'm gonna
the
hold it out.
essay.
Yeah.
And the great thing about illustrations is that the artist, there's a feeling of the artist also being in the field with the subject that they are, actually drawing or writing about. And that I feel doesn't come through in a photograph, because there's always that idea that the camera comes between the subject and the
There's a
yeah,
mediator.
there is a mediator. It is not an immediate translation of what one sees onto paper, etc. There is this lack of hands-onness, if I may call it, about immediately translating what you see through your powers without any interference or without any other media coming in the way. The pencil and paper is also something like that,
It is.
but it is more rudimentary, it is more tactical, as you
Yeah,
said
yeah.
earlier.
There's texture to it. But this comes up a lot in, let's say, hand-drawn animation versus computer-driven, or
Sure.
even the definitions. I'm just saying this as someone who looks at visual studies. The difference between art and craft,
Yes.
broadly, and the handmade, the fact that the artist Sangeeta was there in the
Yes.
field, observing and putting pen, which is a medium, down on paper through her observation, is a powerful and, let's say, immediate connector to nature. No?
Yes, and drawing is
You were very particular about
Yes, I was.
about this
Including
choice of
illustration.
can you speak a little bit more, like, I was thinking about this, and I completely commend you for, I mean, the book, the way the book looks, thanks to Sangeeta's illustrations, is almost a throwback. There's a grace, there's a charm to it. Um, if you had chosen photographs, if you'd gone that direction, can you just like say in a sentence or two, like what would it have done that would have felt jarring to you? Like,
So I think a photograph in a book like this, photographs in a book like this wouldn't match what is being written.
yeah,
So there would be a mismatch, a total mismatch between what I am trying to convey through my writing and the use of photographs to illustrate that writing. Whereas here there is an immediacy there, there is a presence there, and even though a pencil is a medium, the artist is creating it herself.
yeah.
It is not a mechanical thing that is creating it for you.
It's not a reproduction.
It's not a reproduction. So that is the great charm of line drawing or painting or whatever done by a person.
Big thanks to Sangeeta, actually.
Absolutely.
So moving on to the section on birding, Mark Cocker talks so beautifully that's such a gorgeous forward, right? It's spot on in so many ways. He talks about the sheer quality of patient looking that you demonstrate. He laughs at the 3 hours that you spend gently looking at little grebes, and I think with admiration. I am struck by how intensely ways of looking translate into your ways of writing. And I've been talking to you about this for a few weeks now, but I wanted to just talk about two things in writing about specific birds and specific ecologies. And these are GISS, which describes the general characteristics around the species, which a lot of you birders, it's a term that you birders in this room will know, and anthropomorphism, which individualizes birds with human traits to connect them or to imbue them with, I don't know, that kinship. And I'm sure all the writers and artists, and cartoonists deal with that and know that term. I remember talking to Rohan Chakravarti, who was supposed to be here but isn't, on anthropomorphism in his green humor, and how he uses it. In the living air, you have your family of spotted owlets in the garden, you have that Iora that is almost driving you insane with its cries and songs. So when you write about birding in specific places, do you rely on GISS? Does a writer rely on GISS or on behavioral traits, on ecology and habitat, or must the field notes necessarily include, those notes, the changing land use patterns, the observation about the larger agro intensive farming of that the land has been put to use, which is changing everything, like as in the case of bustards, right?
So yes, one can write about what one sees only when one spends a lot of time with that. So unless you spend a lot of time watching birds, you won't be able to recognize them after one sighting. It's difficult. I mean, bird watchers who've been bird watching for a long time, and it's not just the years that you've been bird watching, the amount of time you've spent in those years in the field watching birds. You become adept at watching birds and you recognize them as they fly by. In Hindi we say, no, udti chidiya ke pankh gin lete hain. So it is something like that, sometimes even by a shadow, if a bird is flying overhead, whether it's a kite or a crow, one can tell by the shadow how it moves. So that is where jizz comes in or giz comes in. It's a term coined.
Is it giz?
Giz, yeah. It's used, in both acronyms. It came out in the Second World War when pilots started identifying enemy aircraft on the basis of general impression of size and shape. So, which is how we identify birds also. It's a general impression when you quickly say, okay, this is a Paria kite and not an eagle, or it's a house crow or not a jungle crow and things like that. So that happens only if you are spending a lot of time in the field watching birds. And when you are doing that, then you are imbibing something of the character of the bird. So in writing, if you just went out a couple of times and wanted to write, you would say, okay, there was a drongo sitting on the pole hunting insects. But if you've been with the drongo many times, then you know that there is character in that bird. And this is where anthropomorphism comes in. And character, without bringing in character into your writing, who will read your writing? I mean, you yourself wouldn't like to read, okay, there was a drongo. But if you say that there was a feisty drongo who went
Correct.
after insects and, what it did, how it flew around, pirouetted and circled and came back and whacked the insect on the branch to kill it and eat it, then there's a story you're building. So every anthropomorphism must necessarily come into your writing or your communication because we don't know better.
Yeah.
We only have human words, human feelings, human sensibilities. We don't know what the bird actually feels, and the bird actually doesn't care.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
so there is this barrier we can never cross, or we've never been able to cross till now. It's all human interpretation of non-human things, and there is no common language. So a lot of science is also, in a way, anthropomorphizing what we think that the bird is perhaps doing this. There is some empirical. There are empirical situations happening in experiments, etc. But ultimately, it's interpreted by humans.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And character is such a good way of characterizing it, right? Because it is what imbues a little bit of the humor
Drama.
and the drama.
Yes, absolutely.
And I think, even seeing what we were talking about, that exemplary in the ordinary, can only happen when you have that kind of extended observation of their characters, right?
Yeah,
Of the.
Absolutely.
I thought. Oh, so are you? You're gonna read. I think in terms of characters, my favorite parts of this section was birds on a wire. Because it also you paint pictures of birds in our urban backyards, right? Of their character, but also their visual character. And it's a short enough piece that I think you can read in its entirety, right? Birds
Sure.
on a wire.
Yeah. So this is an entire essay. It's called Bird on a Wire.
Bird on a wire. So,
Since the world got wired, birds have found a new perch. Watching birds on a wire is a fascinating pastime. I have stopped innumerable times on the new flyover connecting Raj Bhavan area in Hyderabad to the Secretariat to admire the neat rows of migrant swallows strung up like musical notes across a calm blue sky. The birds are usually spaced out at wing length, preening or generally acting social. When something disturbs them or they are in play, they slide away with an explosion of exuberant chittering. One very wet and rainy day, a couple of friends and I followed the lustful, feverish yells of a brain fever bird in the forests of Narsapur near Hyderabad until we found the fellow high above the trees, lit up on a wire, singing his heart out. The wire is a perch to an untold variety of birds, and it is one of my favorite watch posts because a bird on a wire is completely visible and much easier to identify. Not that I haven't been stumped by one and turned away blindly by my ignorance. Why can't warblers just play hide and seek with leaves? The wire is also a crow's nest for the avian sentry. It is the cool place to promenade plumes and air arias, to flirt and to fight and flee. The wire offers the ideal change of perspective for pouncing upon the scrumptious little critters scrounging within the angled folds and hinges of grass leaves. It is the launch pad for avian artists to trapeze across the azure top's arched dome, snapping up midges in mid flight with poise and panache. The wire is a clothesline for nature's wardrobe, where the fabric is a multi hued feather. Have you heard of the wire perching bird list? No? Then why don't you start one? Which birds use wires, for what, at what times, in which seasons? Get wired to wire fancying birds. Soon enough, you'll have enough material for your story.
Absolutely. I mean, how many of us have just every day outside KBR Park, right, seen
Yes.
so many stories happening? Um, Next, let's move to the section on birders. It's actually, I really love this section because of the affection that is palpable. So, you've described birding as an individual, solitary activity that you, as an introvert, you've told me this in conversations, that kind of almost took to as a refuge in school. Or, but equally, through your essays, when I read your essays, and actually when I hear you talking about birds like this or reading your own work, birding comes across also as such a social activity for you, full of camaraderie that you enjoy with your friends and family. Like so much of your birding style seems shaped by Hyderabad, the character of Hyderabad, the place by which I mean the geography, of course, the AP, the Andhra Pradesh checklist that you developed with, yeah, with Abdul Ali, right? And Salsa. And your Deccan birder friends, who many of whom are here, but also the culture. You know, the Hyderabadis you meet and the gracious kind of Ganga Jamuni tehzeeb that you describe, the kinship you have with your birding family, and I think young birders may feel with you. So, of the three sections in this essays in this section, my favorite is the one on Siraj Tahir because it captures those links to Hyderabadi tehzeeb so well and very movingly to your father as well. Could you read, for especially for the sake of young birders, a passage from S is for Shikra? Maybe perhaps explaining what the reference is from H is for Hawk.
So, the title of the essay on Mr. Siraj Tahir, I call him Siraj Tahir, is S is for Shikra. S, of course, standing for Siraj here. And it harks to a wonderful uh, biography and autobiography, memoir really, written by Helen MacDonald. And that was her first book that really made her very famous. And this was after she lost her father, who taught her about birds and with whom she birded a lot, and about the art of falconry. She learned it from him. And as though in the book she reimagines her life with her father by taking up and training a hawk from its raw state into a one which came to her fist. But because Siraj Saab loved birds of prey himself, and the Shikra was a favorite of his, so I titled it as for Shikra. And just for perspective, he and my father were classmates in grammar boys school, and which shows that he was a generation older than me. But there was this wonderful kinship, and he was like a colleague to me more than a friend, more than a senior. So I am very happy to reach this part of the chapter. Before I start, the Birdwatchers Society of Andhra Pradesh was known as the Birdwatchers Club at that time. It hadn't been registered. And like most British clubs at such society, they were called clubs. They are still called clubs. So we called ourselves a club. And so this is, Siraj Saab and I were part of this organization, and so many others were at that time. So I start reading. After a couple of outings together as part of the BCAP, or Birdwatchers Club of Andhra Pradesh, we began to hit it off. To this too, there was a quirky angle, which shows the apnapan, an extended kinship, of those days. One evening, he met an old school friend of his in Riyazat Hussein's iconic bookshop on Abbott Road, A. Hussain and Company. After the pleasantries and backslapping subsided, under the convivial eye of the senior Mr. Hussain, Siraj Sahib asked him, अरे एक बच्चा आता है हमारे चिड़ियों के क्लब में, तू जानता क्या? There's this boy in our birding club, do you know him? In a city steeped in social niceties, the use of the tu was reserved for those that were dear to one, unlike the rough meaning it is ascribed today. अपना ही बच्चा है सिराज, he's our kid, chuckled my father. Again there was that tehzeeb, not the grasping mera bacha, my son, but the inclusive apna, our. At our next outing, he stumped me with a loud, अरे तुम बोले ही नहीं कि मुरारी के बेटे हो? Hey, you never told me you are Murari's son. Seeing me look taken aback, he chortled out the bookshop episode. After that, my birding outings received no querulous or disapproving looks at home. After all, I was going out with Sharif Log, respectable, dignified people. Thus began a lifelong association with one of the finest people I have known. In some matters, he took me under his wing. In others, we did things together. That Sharif quality of the man, I think, was ultimately what drew so many people to BCAP, which was rechristened Birdwatching Society of Andhra Pradesh upon its registration. The hierarchy of the organization was never apparent to any of the participants, except for Mr. Pushpa Kumar, the top gun in the Andhra Pradesh Forest Department, who was thus accorded a genteel deference by the elder birders. The subtle unsavoriness of implied superiority, whether of rank or knowledge, never left its residue on any of us youngsters. Everyone traveled together in the forest department's jeeps. All of us walked to where the birds were. Victuals were mutually partaken of, and the day's count discussed later in a much anticipated circle of friendship. Topical and irreverent banter and repartee were the norm. This was an exceptional illustration of the altruistic spirit of those who planned, promoted, popularized, and participated in this pastime. To my mind, it was a single factor that contributed to the organization's successful promotion of an undoubtedly new concept of outdoor activity for the citizenry of Hyderabad. Plus, who could deny that element of thrill shrouded in the past of fondly recalled boyhood days, of a Boy Scout's revving adrenaline, of a golden nostalgia that tugs adults to another shot at nirvana? The wilderness and its wildlings does such things to men.
Wonderful. Sounds idyllic. No? And I'm sure many in the audience also knew Siraj.
Of course, of course.
Let's move to the last section on my kind of birding, called My Kind of Birding. And finally, we come to slow birding, a term I have grown to love. That actually, I encountered and I've begun to think about through you. You describe beautifully the intrusive nature of birding tourism, destination birding, twitching, photography with fancy optical equipment, insensitive auditory stimuli through bird sound playback. And throughout, I saw at least a wistful tone about the erosion of the birders' code, with birders not always recognizing their own impact on the our non-human species, our commensals, as you call them. Can you tell us a little bit about this moral code, and what should we do as nature lovers and incipient or seasoned birders in order to bird more mindfully, ethically, morally, and perhaps maybe round out your answer with a reading from My Kind of Birding?
Sure. So the birder's code is very simple in my mind. The bird should always come first in whatever you are doing in your birding activity, whether you are a scientist, an ornithologist, whether you're a birder, whether you're a photographer, professional or otherwise. The safety of the bird is paramount. And you should understand that you may not directly threaten a bird, but your activity can threaten its existence because there are predators around who are looking, who perhaps don't know where a nest exists, but because of your repeated trips to see a nest or to photograph it, they realize that there is something there. And the bird or its chicks or eggs may not survive because the predator will get it later on. And I have spoken about the fact that neither can understand each other. I mean, it's a barrier we haven't been able to pass through. And trying to understand non-human life or non-human feelings and interpret them in your own way is it's complete stupidity.
Arrogance.
Arrogance, hubris at some times. And so you have to be mindful. First, you have to be mindful. You have to take time. You have to give the bird time. And if you are in a rush, you are there on a holiday, and it's just 1 day or 1 hour you are there, then let the bird be. I mean, would you allow a tourist to Hyderabad to enter your house just to see what you are doing? It's the same thing. You're intruding. Ultimately, you're intruding. So have that sensitivity for something that you like, or you say you think you like. You tell the world that you like it, but you are very happy to disturb it out of its home. You're very happy to call it by continuous playback, and just because you want to see it, it's not fair. And the bird deserves much more than what you are willing to give it. And when the bird comes repeatedly to your call, it gets exhausted. Ultimately, it's a give and take of the energy it consumes by eating and how it spends it. You should allow and respect and accept the fact that that energy should be spent in the normal way the bird wants to live.
Its own rituals and seasonality.
Yes.
Right?
Not trying to expend it to see who is this come that is playing the call. I mean, it doesn't know that there's a call being played. It thinks that there is an intruder into its territory, and it comes to fight that intruder out. So it's just waste of energy for the bird. And then photographing, gardening around the nest, snipping of branches or leaves which come in the way. Touching, of course, that is absolute anathema. You should never do it. And so these are things that you have to really step back from. And if there are people who are doing it, and there are people there who understand that what is being done is wrong, then such people should put their foot down and tell them that this is not. You'd be surprised to know that in a recent paper came out that on a seabird breeding island of Norway, there was a survey done about intrusion into the birding. So they divided the visitors between bird watchers, professional photographers, and ornithologists. And those that came across as most uncaring or arrogant about their attitudes were the professional photographers. They said, "We know exactly what we are doing. Can you see the fellow is just sitting on its nest, it's not disturbed." How will you know the level of anxiety that the bird is going through? So that if the flight distance is less, if the bird is not scared till you are even 10 feet away from it, it doesn't mean that it is not suffering anxiety. I mean, only if it flies away will you say, yes, that is a distance I should keep away from.
Again, back to the hubris really of even with auditory playback.
Yes.
All of us using apps, while it's making it easier for us to identify birds, right? You realize now, in retrospect, I think how intrusive must it be to keep doing it until we get our taxonomy straight. Again, arrogance.
Yeah, that's true. So one has to be really sentient about these things. One has to be empathetic to other life forms, and one has to understand that it's a privilege to see them. It's not a right. If you really look at it, that ultimately these are things that don't care about you. I mean, you'd fall flat on your face if you really realize that you don't exist in their world. And their world can exist in its entirety without you, but not vice versa. So that respect has to be given to them.
We saw some of this in the pandemic,
True.
right? And
True,
then
absolutely.
completely forgotten afterwards. Yeah.
True.
So Aasheesh, would you like to read just to round out this lovely evening from My Kind of Birding, right?
Yeah.
I'm so happy to see people in the audience reading along with you.
So I started not chasing birds, but just being with them and enjoying my time with them. I was happy to just see one bird when I went birding and not move on to other birds. And this chapter sort of, this essay stems from that philosophy of slowing down your birding experience, your rush to birds. So I think I'll read the concluding part of this essay. In the field, this approach opens the doors of a new world to your mind's eye. You remain standing in front of a fruiting neem while the larger group of birders moves on, having identified one or two species. You inhale the aroma of its foliage. A fluty whistle from its canopy leads your eye to the Iora. He is dressed in breeding regalia, a jet cap and coat, deep canary shirt, white epaulets. He quotes a hen Iora with song, he postures, he patrons. His aria persuades her and dissuades rivals from his territory. You do not exist in his scheme of things, just in your own sensory world as a witness. You stay with him as he perambulates through the leafy canopy, lifting his wobbling beak skywards, fluffing his velvet beret, vibrating his dark tail, standing on tiptoe in a fervor of his operatic song. You are trapped by its intensity. You are mesmerized by its elemental simplicity, by the realization that the Iora's entire world in that moment is its song, and that he has enmeshed you in it, albeit momentarily, till your focus expands to take in the larger picture, the shining curved leaves of the neem, the soft yellow fruit pods, the darkening bark damp from last night's rain, the tangled undergrowth. You spy a movement from the corner of your eye and realize it is an Aasheesh that's flown into the Iora's name, and you stay with it. As your senses expand, your absorption of the drama around you becomes acute, and before you are aware of it, you are invisible to yourself, a part of the very landscape you've come to partake of, all eyes and ears, inhaling its scents, feeling it on your skin. If you become aware of yourself, the spell is broken and the pageant melts away into simple, mundane two dimensionality. The trick is to make yourself invisible while remaining completely present in your surroundings. Now you are on the path to my kind of birding.
Absolutely wonderful. And I think that's a really good place to stop with
Yes,
that
absolutely.
on that line, and we've taken a lot of time, and I'm sure there are questions from the audience.
Yes.
So thank you, Aasheesh. It was lovely to, I think, go through the living air with you again, and it has given me a great deal of joy and pleasure reading it and being
Thank
with
you.
it.
Thank you, Sita. Discussing the book with you has revealed many insights that even I, didn't understand so clearly. But now, after our discussions and after this discussion, not only have I understood things a lot more clearly, but I also hope that people in the audience realize that there's more to it than just the birds and the environments that I speak about.
Yeah, absolutely. Nature writing. One of its best people to sections, but I think this is a good time to kind of like invite questions from the audience and online questions that Anita will channel. Yeah, and so there are anybody wants to ask him about the next two sections also. Aasheesh has readings ready in terms of the questions.
So we'll take questions. I just request you to, so that more people can ask, to keep the questions brief and stay with questions. If there are comments and observations, maybe we can take them after the formal session is over and when you're conversing with Aasheesh, but we'll stay with the questions for now. Yeah. Yes.
Aasheesh, dear Aasheesh, little bit of a bird watcher. Just I want
There's a mic coming on.
No.
Yeah, hello friends. Yeah,
Hello.
the book name, what I feel, might have been Air and Eves. Anyway,
Might have been.
Air and Eves.
Okay.
That's one part. As schoolboys, we used to see a bird, the sparrow bird. Nowadays, it's not. It's still there in the earth, or is it gone extinct? Whatever now. The small chimney which we used to say.
No, the bird is
As
still.
school kids, we used to see that.
Yeah, it's still there. It's
Okay.
found in Hyderabad also.
Oh, correct. Then sparrow, then even that small crow. Crows are very rare.
Yeah, compared to the sparrow, it is a much bigger bird, but it is there. Even crows are found. You're right in saying that their numbers have lessened.
Yeah, fewer numbers.
They are, but they are there.
Nice reading and nice book.
Thank you.
After air, why don't you go to next level? Earth. Earth and water.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Thank
water.
you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. I do book reviews also.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
thank you. Aasheesh, my question is, according to you, which of the musical interludes are closer to you in the bird songs? Either Hindustani classical or Western classical? Just because I want raising this question as having a little good ear, not so.
So in Western classical, I am not too familiar with it, but the Lark Ascending is an old favorite. It's very popular in England and not so popular elsewhere, but I like it quite a bit because it somehow represents. But there's a great story about a nightingale being recorded. I don't know if you heard it. So I think it was in the 60s that this cellist in England decided to play along with a singing nightingale in a backyard.
Wow.
And BBC wanted to do a live for the first time. And for a long time, the bird didn't respond. And all the wires were set, etc., etc. And suddenly, at the end of the session, the bird started singing. And she's playing on her cello, and the bird is singing. It's a duet that has been recorded and available on YouTube also. And that tradition continues with another guy he sings, and he invites people over into his backyard, and when the nightingale sings. So these are a few of them, and I'm sure there are more in Western classical, but in Hindustani classical there are so many. All the ritus have got invariably the koel comes in, invariably the papiya comes in, invariably the moor, the chat, all the birds come. All of them come in. So in Hindustan class, I'm sure in Carnatic I don't listen to it much, but I'm sure it must be there in that too.
And there are, so in classical Gharanas, there are rags named out of birds also. So
Recently I learned that the Vihang is bird in Sanskrit. So not sung by many people, but Mallikarjun Mansoor has sung a Vihang rag. And Hamsadhwani. That's a Carnatic rag basically.
By Muthuswami Dikshita.
Hello. So I have a question regarding, so in your observations, have you seen if birds have changed their behavior over time in response to human constructions or human forays into wildlife? For example, I know that frogs have changed their volume of calls due to airport noises. So have you noticed anything similar to how birds have changed their behavior?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the obvious answer is the sparrow, as he was talking about. And there's an essay in the book on the sparrow. And when I was young, the sparrows were everywhere. And as I grew older, the question always in society was, where have the sparrows gone? And so I think it was the change in the way we constructed our houses, the way we also dealt with our landscapes. Urban landscapes, sparrows need some banjar jameen, some rough spaces. They don't need manicured lawns and rose bushes and all. They need a dusty place to dust bathe in. They need brambles, etc., to rummage in for insects. where they can pick up nesting material, and they need those nooks and crannies in houses where they can build their nest because they are whole nesters basically. So with the change in the way with RCC coming in and these places not being available, so that is one change that happened. Then I think that birds in urban areas, I was going to say talk, but they actually call louder than they do in non-urban areas because of the sound levels. Human sound levels in urban areas are much higher. So Aasheesh Pittie perhaps has to call much louder to be heard across the road or across a group of houses. That's another thing that has changed definitely.
Areas more and more, we are finding that things like higher amount of light pollution is there in even in rural areas or roadways or a lot of things. So has that a country like a worldwide thing, not just in urban areas or in other areas too?
No, light dependence of humans has increased all around the world. So that is a common problem, if I may call it, everywhere. But these are things that are not really studied. We talk about it, but it needs a lot of involved study to find out whether how light is affecting birds or not. Like even the highways where traffic moves, moving traffic light itself affects animals from crossing the road. They get mesmerized. I mean, I have seen in forest trails also when people go in jeeps, etc., that nightjar sits right there, mesmerized by the jeep lights. It won't move. You can actually get down from the jeep and catch it and put it to the side. So these are things that are not there in the natural environment. These are things we are changing. So obviously there are changes in the birding world or in the animal world, but studying them requires a lot of effort.
Yes, please.
Hi. Have you noticed any observable change in migration patterns as well of birds? And what could possibly be the reasons as well?
So obvious changes are perhaps changes in the dates of arrival and departure. They're coming later in the year. Everybody says it's climate change, but there is also this thing that suppose you're planning a trip to Bangalore and you want to stop on the way for lunch, and when you reach there, you realize that that restaurant is no longer there. That's what is happening to birds that come on migration. There are many places they stop on the way for refueling because they do have to get down and refuel, and if that wetland is not there, and if that forest is not there full of insects, or if rain is delayed, which causes insects not to breed, then what do they feed on? So those are things that are affecting migration a lot, and because of that, the population of migrating birds has come down a lot. Where we used to see, I have counted 4,000 ducks on Tangmund. Now nobody sees ducks on Tangmund. But Tangmund is another story where pollution has come, and pollution is a big story for our wetlands. So these are the things that affect migratory birds a lot.
Could it also be because of the increasing number of birds that are there, which don't allow migrating birds to come in?
No, that is not a thing. No, not at all. You mean resident birds?
Yeah, resident birds.
Which species is increasing except the pigeons? Yeah. that is our problem, not the pigeons' problem. The more we feed it, the more it will.
Hello, so here.
Yeah.
So I'm an animal lover who feeds stray animals and street animals. But so recently I have realized how birds also come into the ecosystem in a very large way. But interacting with birds is a whole new level because they don't come and act or behave like dogs or cats. The moment they see a human, they fly away. So I've been trying small steps to interact with them. Do you have any suggestions?
Yes, I do. Don't interact with them.
Because I have like a farmhouse where I feed. I mean, I put water and whatever I can. But interact is just because I want to rescue them as well. If in case because I generally see them around and they're very frightened by humans, especially the local birds here.
You should go indoors. So the thing is about birds, try not to help them, because you can't help them. You don't know what they eat. You won't be able to get what they eat for them. How will you collect 100 cockroaches together? So what do you feed them, And taking care of them is very difficult. And more than that, if you are successful in taking care of them, they get imprinted with you. So what does imprinted mean? You become its mother lifelong. Do you want to take that responsibility?
I mean, I have dogs and cats at home, but
Okay. So the thing is, birds are best enjoyed free. Let them be free. Don't try to, leave water for them, fine. I would say don't even feed them, because we don't have extremes of climate like the West has, it snows, etc. So we don't need to feed them birds. Our local birds find food throughout the season. Yeah, you should get a pair of binoculars and start watching birds. Makes all the difference. I heard.
Yeah, she's congrats.
Thank you.
Yeah, as a journalist, I'm worried about this thing. You gave me a story 20 years back. That was a great story on new bird found in India.
Yes.
That was somewhere in Assam. We don't hear such stories anymore.
Well, that's a question that I wish I could answer positively. But discovering new species, birds is supposed to be almost megafauna in a way. It's not the size of an elephant. But, why is bird watching so popular? Because birds are everywhere. And because they are everywhere, almost every bird on the earth has been discovered. So it's very difficult to discover a new bird. What they discover now is by DNA testing, if they are able to say, okay, this is a subspecies which was not recognized. Those things are going on, but they will not, an entirely new species is very difficult to discover. But we are discovering hordes and hordes of reptiles, frogs, lizards, bats, and smaller invertebrates. We are in, and I think that's a huge ocean. If one goes into bacteria and into lice and all, I mean, biodiversity is just, we haven't even touched it with a pinprick.
And if I can add to that, I think you're more likely to have a breaking story on disappearance rather than appearance, sadly. So
True.
that's what.
Hi, Aasheesh, sir. I'm Murtuza, and I have been fortunate to order your book, pre-order your book actually. And my question is directly regarding the book and your writing style. I browsed some of the chapters, I read some of the chapters, and most of the chapters that I see, there's a sense of loss and anguish and pain in that, and kind of lamenting almost. So, is this, you chose the book as a venue to vent out your feelings, or did they came out, unconsciously? Thank you.
No, I suppose. I don't know how to answer that. I didn't think it was so morose, but I think that is just a way of writing, and it's more nostalgic than a sense of loss. Nostalgia need not be loss; it's remembrance also, and so I think I come from that angle more than anything else.
Aasheesh, I have a question. What is the lifespan of various common well-known birds?
So most of the answers you'll get on Google, but it's difficult to. I am not sure about them. Like, I think the big cockatoos, etc., live for what 20, 30 years.
Three dozen, 4 dozen. Depends very based on size.
Yeah,
of the
depends
bird.
on sizes. And only zoos may have records, where they have lived for a long time. But that is not ideal conditions. They
We
are.
also have condors that have lived for
Yeah.
up to 4 years. So it varies very widely.
The range is very wide.
The
Very
range is
wide.
very wide.
Migrant birds have been recaptured after 20 years. So imagine doing a journey of 40,000 kilometers twice a year, and surviving for even 8 years or 10 years. It's immense. So
Kingfisher or eagle or
it's difficult to answer. It's really difficult. Because you will only know if you ring it as a chick and again capture it in its last days, so to say. How do you ringing histories, or that's all one knows. So depends on different birds, depends on how they have lived, whether they migrate or they don't migrate. It's a difficult question to answer. Yeah, Farida.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Mr. Pittie. So my question is, there are two questions just because I got the mic. One is that from bird watching to bird photographing to e-birding transition. I want you to comment on that. And the second one is, how are we going to use this book to reach out to the policymakers? Because there's so much happening in a city like Hyderabad, complete change of ecosystem and things like that. Can we do something there?
So trust Farida to catch the bull by the horn straight away. From here to, she said,
Bird watching to bird photography to e-birding.
Yeah. Bird photography has contributed a lot and will contribute a lot to birding. There's a question of some ethics involved there, and in my view, the bird always comes first, or whatever animal you are interested, that should always come first, period. There's no second to it, that no, I'll get a better picture if I move closer to it, or you don't know how you're affecting it. It may seem that it's not stressed, but how do you know? And who are you to judge what it's feeling? You'll be very surprised, Farida. I just read a paper, and this is a research done empirically to study effect on nesting birds on a nesting colony in Netherlands. And they questioned normal. You had to go by boat, especially to bird watch there. Normal bird watchers, experienced bird watchers, and experienced photographers. Normal photographers they took as normal bird watchers, and the most likely to disturb the birds were the experienced photographers, because they said that we know what we are doing. We know the bird won't get affected by us. I know exactly how close I can go to it. That's not the case. So birding photography has contributed a lot, and we have some excellent photographers in India and around the world. And I'm sure that this ethic is getting ingrained into them. I know a lot of photographers who've changed and reduced their photography to watching birds more. And what was perhaps a hardcore bird photography organization has begun to take out children and conduct more birding tours. So that's a positive sign I see. Using this book as a policy changer is a little difficult. There are many essays in it which I have over the years tried to through them change policy, but it just doesn't happen. It's like water off a duck's back. Nobody bothers. And the only thing is that because policy making and implementation is a government, what should I say, prerogative, and we can't do anything about it except what they think is protest. Whereas we are saying, no, it's our right to have, so many birds sing in our neighborhood. This, if it can find empathy among administrators, then it might help. Because it talks about a different aspect of nature, which is not statistics, which is not numbers, which is not graphs, but where you connect with nature. So maybe.
As they say, sometimes a word spoken softly rings loudest. So, we have a question from the back.
Hello.
This is related to the now, if you see, even in Hyderabad, we are coming up with the urban parks and more of even the natural forest systems getting into plantations. There are more plantations as well. Okay, to cover, and there is one say whichever everything which is green is not a forest, right? So my question here is, did you see the difference in diversity of the birds, which is in, like, say example, any of the reserve forest which we have been there for a longer time? There are plantations. Is there any difference in the diversity between the plantation forest as well as the natural habitat?
See, theoretically, of course, there will be a difference. But it's my good fortune not to have birded in plantations so much. So I have birded when the forests were intact, so I really won't be able to answer you. But there will be a difference, and you know it.
Why eclissat?
So eclissat is a it's a different place.
Because there are more urban parks coming in Hyderabad, right?
That's true. That's true.
So
And unfortunately, also emphasis on exotics, etc.
Yes.
Where so we want this big growth. We want this beautiful flowers, flowering trees, etc.
colorful.
Yeah. That's not how the landscape is. If you only find beauty in that big and bold flower, and you won't find it in the monsoonal ephemerals that come up, then you're not looking deep enough. And your way of looking is shallow, I will say, almost, where you can only see the glaring and the bright, but not what exists otherwise. So that is the difference in.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much for all your questions. We had a really nice range of questions, and thank you, Aasheesh, for answering all of them. And I'm sure you can continue the conversation offline. There are books behind, so Aasheesh is happy to sign copies for any of you who would like to have them signed by him. So thank you so much again for coming and for this launch.
May I give this to Aasheesh to start with?
Thank
you so much for being here. Sita for conducting a beautiful, beautiful conversation. Anita, all the way from Delhi. Thank you so much.
I'd like to thank everyone at Goethe-Zentrum for hosting us and for allowing us to continue on this lovely journey.